When a renowned writer finds herself at the center of a high-profile trial, the world watches as the truth unfolds. Accused of a crime she swears she didn't commit, she must fight against a system that seems determined to silence her. But in a case where power and deception collide, nothing is as it seems. The courtroom was a grand, imposing space, with dark wooden walls that seemed to absorb the light. The air was thick with tension, and the murmurs of the audience echoed like distant thunder. At the center of it all sat Camille Harper, a renowned African-American writer, her face serene but her fists clenched tightly in her lap. Across from her, Judge Samuel Whitmore, a white man with a wrinkled face and a stern gaze, looked down at her with disdain. The trial had begun, and the charges were severe. Camille was accused of setting fire to the home of Senator Richard Holloway, a powerful and controversial figure. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Witnesses claimed to have seen her near the senator's house on the night of the fire. On her laptop, investigators found drafts of a novel featuring a protagonist who bore an uncanny resemblance to Holloway, a man consumed by his own hypocrisy. The internet was ablaze with theories. Was this an intellectual rebellion turned into revenge? The prosecution painted Camille as a radical, a woman who wanted to send a message with fire. They argued that her novel was a blueprint for the crime, a fictionalized version of her real intentions. The defense, however, insisted that there was no direct evidence linking her to the fire. They pointed out that the witnesses had only seen someone who looked like her, and that the novel was just that, a work of fiction. But Judge Whitmore seemed to have already made up his mind. His cold, dismissive demeanor suggested that he saw Camille as guilty long before the trial had even begun. Camille, for her part, maintained her innocence. "I didn't do it," she repeated, her voice steady but filled with quiet defiance. She knew the odds were against her. The system was stacked in favor of people like Holloway, and she was just a writer, a woman of color in a world that often dismissed her voice. But she refused to back down. She would fight, not just for herself, but for the truth. As the trial progressed, the prosecution called their first witness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Camille near the senator's house on the night of the fire. The man, a middle-aged white man with a nervous demeanor, took the stand and recounted his story. He spoke of seeing a woman who matched Camille's description, lurking near the house just hours before the fire broke out. But under cross-examination, the defense attorney, a sharp woman named Lisa Morales, began to poke holes in his testimony. "Are you absolutely certain it was Ms. Harper you saw that night?" Morales asked, her tone calm but probing. The witness hesitated. "Well, I mean, it looked like her. She had the same hair, the same build." "But you didn't see her face clearly, did you?" Morales pressed. The witness shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No, I guess not. It was dark, and she was wearing a hood." Morales nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "So, it's possible that it wasn't Ms. Harper at all, isn't it?" The witness stammered, but before he could respond, the judge intervened. "That's enough, Ms. Morales. The witness has answered the question." But the damage had been done. The jury had seen the doubt in the witness's eyes, and for the first time, Camille allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would see through the lies. The next witness was a forensic expert, a man in a crisp suit who spoke in a monotone voice as he explained the evidence found at the scene. He described the charred remains of the house, the patterns of the fire, and the accelerants used to start it. But when Morales took over the cross-examination, she focused on one key point: the identity of the body found in the house. "The remains were too badly burned to confirm the identity, correct?" she asked. The expert nodded. "Yes, that's correct. The fire was extremely intense, and the body was almost completely cremated. So, it's possible that the body isn't Senator Holloway's at all, isn't it?" The expert hesitated. "It's possible, yes." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel to restore order. But the seed of doubt had been planted. If the body wasn't Holloway's, then where was he? And why had he disappeared? As the trial continued, the defense began to uncover more cracks in the prosecution's case. A security guard from the neighborhood, who had initially claimed to have seen Camille near the house, changed his story on the stand. Under pressure from Morales, he admitted that he hadn't actually seen her face clearly. He had only assumed it was her based on her appearance. Then, there was the matter of Holloway's finances. The defense presented evidence that the senator had a secret bank account, from which he had withdrawn large sums of money just before the fire. What was he planning to do with that money? And why had he disappeared so suddenly? The trial was becoming a media spectacle. News outlets were filled with headlines about the case, and social media was buzzing with theories. Some people believed Camille was innocent, a victim of a corrupt system. Others thought she was a mastermind, a woman who had orchestrated the perfect crime. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that there was more to the story than anyone had realized. Camille sat through it all, her face a mask of calm determination. She knew the truth, and she was determined to make sure it came out. But as the days passed, the pressure began to weigh on her. The stares of the jury, the whispers of the audience, the cold disdain of the judge. It was all too much. She felt like she was drowning, struggling to keep her head above water. But she refused to give up. She had fought too hard, come too far, to let them win. She would see this through to the end, no matter what it took. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial entered its second week. Camille Harper sat at the defense table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had spent the last few days listening to the prosecution's case, watching as they presented what they claimed was irrefutable evidence against her. But now, it was the defense's turn to speak, and Camille could feel the weight of the room's attention shifting. Lisa Morales, Camille's defense attorney, stood and approached the jury. She was a tall, confident woman with a sharp mind and a commanding presence. She began by addressing the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence linking Camille to the fire. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morales began, her voice steady and clear, "what we have here is a case built on assumptions, not facts. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client, Camille Harper, set fire to Senator Holloway's home out of some twisted desire for revenge. But where is the proof? Where is the direct evidence that ties her to this crime?" She paused, letting her words sink in. The witnesses who claimed to have seen Ms. Harper near the senator's house that night have admitted under cross-examination that they didn't see her face clearly. They saw a figure, a shadow, and assumed it was her. But assumptions are not evidence. And without evidence, there can be no conviction. Morales then turned her attention to the novel found on Camille's laptop. The prosecution has made much of the fact that Ms. Harper was writing a novel featuring a character who resembles Senator Holloway. They want you to believe that this fictional work is somehow a blueprint for a real-life crime. But let me ask you this. Since when has writing a story become a crime? Since when has creativity been equated with guilt? The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable. Morales continued, her voice rising with passion. "Ms. Harper is a writer. She creates stories, characters, and worlds. That is her job. That is her passion. To suggest that her work is anything more than fiction is not only absurd but dangerous. It sets a precedent that could silence artists, writers, and thinkers everywhere. Is that the kind of world we want to live in?" Camille felt a surge of gratitude toward Morales. The attorney was fighting for her with everything she had, and Camille knew she couldn't have asked for a better advocate. But as she glanced at Judge Whitmore, she saw the same cold, dismissive expression on his face. He wasn't convinced. And if he wasn't convinced, the jury might not be either. The defense called its first witness, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a forensic expert with decades of experience in fire investigations. Dr. Carter took the stand and explained in detail the findings from the scene of the fire. She confirmed that the body found in the house was too badly burned to be identified and that there was no way to determine with certainty whether it was Senator Holloway. Based on the evidence, Dr. Carter said, it's entirely possible that the body is not Senator Holloway's. Without DNA evidence or dental records, we simply cannot say for sure. Morales nodded, her expression serious. So, it's possible that Senator Holloway is still alive? Dr. Carter hesitated. It's possible, yes. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel to restore order. But the damage had been done. The jury had heard the expert's testimony, and the seed of doubt had been planted. Next, the defense called a financial analyst to the stand. The analyst, a middle-aged man with glasses and a calm demeanor, explained that Senator Holloway had a secret bank account from which he had withdrawn large sums of money in the weeks leading up to the fire. These withdrawals were unusual, the analyst said. They were made in cash, and there's no record of what the money was used for. It's possible that Senator Holloway was preparing to disappear. Morales pressed further. Is it also possible that Senator Holloway staged his own death and framed my client for the crime? The analyst hesitated. It's possible, yes. The courtroom was silent as the implications of the analyst's words sank in. If Holloway had staged his own death, then Camille was innocent. But if that was the case, where was Holloway now? And why had he chosen to disappear? As the trial continued, the defense presented more evidence to support their theory. They called witnesses who testified to Holloway's erratic behavior in the weeks before the fire, his growing paranoia, and his increasing isolation. They presented documents showing that Holloway had been under investigation for corruption and that he had been facing mounting pressure from the media and his political opponents. But the prosecution fought back, arguing that the defense's theory was nothing more than speculation. They insisted that Camille was guilty, that she had set the fire to silence Holloway and make a statement. They pointed to her novel as evidence of her motive, claiming that it was a thinly veiled threat against the senator. The trial became a battle of narratives, each side trying to convince the jury of their version of the truth. Camille sat through it all, her emotions a whirlwind of fear, anger, and hope. She knew the truth, but would the jury believe her, or would they see her as the prosecution painted her? A radical, a criminal, a threat? As the days passed, the pressure mounted. The media coverage intensified, and Camille found herself at the center of a national controversy. Supporters rallied behind her, calling for justice and demanding her release. Critics accused her of playing the victim, of using her race and gender to manipulate the system. Camille tried to block out the noise, to focus on the trial, but it was impossible. The world was watching, and she could feel their eyes on her. The final days of the trial were a blur for Camille. The defense and prosecution delivered their closing arguments, each side making their final plea to the jury. Morales was eloquent and impassioned, her words ringing through the courtroom as she dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morales said, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "this case is not just about Camille Harper. It's about justice. It's about the truth. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client is guilty based on assumptions, coincidences, and circumstantial evidence. But that's not how our justice system works. In this country, you are innocent until proven guilty, and the prosecution has not proven anything." She paused, letting her words sink in. Camille Harper is a writer. She is a storyteller, but she is not a criminal. She did not set that fire. She did not kill Senator Holloway. And she certainly did not stage some elaborate plot to frame herself for a crime she didn't commit. The real question here is not whether Camille Harper is guilty. It's why the prosecution is so desperate to convict her. What are they trying to hide? The prosecution's closing argument was equally forceful. They painted Camille as a calculating and dangerous woman, someone who had used her intellect and creativity to commit a heinous crime. They urged the jury to look at the evidence, to see the patterns, and to deliver a verdict that would send a message. No one was above the law. But as the jury deliberated, Camille could feel the weight of the trial pressing down on her. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She thought about her life, her career, and everything she had worked for. She thought about the novel she had been writing, the story that had become so twisted and distorted in the hands of the prosecution. And she thought about Senator Holloway, the man at the center of it all. Where was he? What had really happened that night? Hours passed, and the tension in the courtroom grew. Finally, the jury returned with their verdict. Camille stood, her heart pounding, as the foreperson read the words that would determine her fate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Camille Harper, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Camille felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. Judge Whitmore's face darkened, and he slammed his gavel to silence the room. He turned to Camille, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "while the jury has found you not guilty, let me be clear. This court does not condone your actions. You may have escaped justice today, but you will not escape the consequences of your choices." Camille stared at him, her relief turning to anger. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but Morales placed a hand on her arm, silently urging her to stay quiet. The judge's words hung in the air, a bitter reminder that even in victory, Camille was not truly free. As she left the courtroom, Camille was surrounded by reporters, their cameras flashing and their voices shouting questions. She ignored them, her mind focused on one thing: finding out the truth. She knew the trial was over. But her fight was far from finished. Senator Holloway was still out there, and she was determined to uncover what had really happened. The days following the trial were a whirlwind for Camille Harper. Though she had been acquitted, the shadow of the accusations still loomed over her. The media continued to dissect every detail of the case, and public opinion remained sharply divided. Some hailed her as a hero, a woman who had stood up to a corrupt system. Others saw her as a criminal who had somehow escaped justice. Camille tried to block out the noise, but it was impossible. Her life had been turned upside down, and she knew it would never be the same. But Camille wasn't one to sit back and let others dictate her story. She was a writer, a seeker of truth, and she was determined to uncover what had really happened the night of the fire. She began by reaching out to Lisa Morales, her defense attorney, who had become an unexpected ally in the fight for justice. "I need your help," Camille said when they met in Morales's office a few days after the trial. "I need to find out what happened to Holloway. I need to clear my name, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the world." Morales leaned back in her chair, studying Camille with a thoughtful expression. "You know this won't be easy, right? Holloway's disappearance is a mystery, and the people who might have answers aren't exactly going to be eager to talk." "I know," Camille said, her voice firm, "but I have to try. I can't just let this go." Morales nodded. "All right, I'll help you, but we need to be careful. If Holloway really did stage his own death, he's not going to want anyone digging into his business, and if he's still out there, he's dangerous." With Morales's help, Camille began to piece together the puzzle. They started by revisiting the evidence from the trial, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. One detail in particular stood out: the security guard who had initially claimed to have seen Camille near Holloway's house the night of the fire. His testimony had been shaky, and under cross-examination, he had admitted that he hadn't seen her face clearly. Camille wondered if he had been pressured into lying, and if so, by whom. She decided to track him down. His name was Frank Delaney, and he lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. When Camille knocked on his door, he looked surprised and nervous. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Camille said. "About your testimony, about what really happened that night." Delaney hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. His apartment was small and cluttered, the walls lined with photos of his family. He gestured for Camille to sit, then took a seat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I didn't want to lie," he said after a long pause. "But they made me. They said if I didn't testify against you, I'd lose my job. Maybe worse." Camille leaned forward, her heart racing. "Who made you? Who told you to lie?" Delaney shook his head. "I don't know their names, they didn't introduce themselves. They just showed up one day, told me what to say, and threatened me if I didn't cooperate." Camille's mind raced. If someone had pressured Delaney into lying, it meant there was more to the story than she had realized. It meant that someone, maybe Holloway, maybe someone else, had gone to great lengths to frame her. But why? What were they trying to hide? She thanked Delaney and left, her mind buzzing with questions. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the sense of unease lingered. Her next stop was the bank where Holloway had made his mysterious withdrawals. Morales had managed to get a court order to access the records, and Camille hoped they would provide some clues. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, handed over the documents with a look of disapproval. "This is highly unusual," the manager said. "But the court order is clear. Just be careful with this information." Camille nodded, her eyes already scanning the documents. The withdrawals were large, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, and they had been made in cash. There was no record of where the money had gone, but Camille noticed something interesting. The withdrawals had started just a few weeks before the fire. It was as if Holloway had been preparing for something big. She took the documents back to Morales's office, where they spent hours poring over the details. Morales pointed out that the withdrawals had been made from a secret account, one that wasn't tied to Holloway's public finances. It was a slush fund, she explained, the kind of thing politicians used to hide money from prying eyes. "This is big," Morales said. "If we can prove that Holloway was using this account to fund something illegal, it could blow the whole case wide open." Camille nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. If Holloway had been using the money to stage his own death, where had it gone? And who had helped him? She needed answers, and she knew there was only one place left to look: the remains of Holloway's house. The charred remains of Senator Richard Holloway's house stood as a grim reminder of the fire that had destroyed it. The once grand home was now a skeleton of blackened beams and crumbling walls, surrounded by yellow police tape and the lingering smell of smoke. Camille Harper stood at the edge of the property, her heart pounding as she stared at the ruins. This was the place where everything had started, the place that had become the center of her nightmare. And now, it was the key to uncovering the truth. With Morales's help, Camille had obtained permission to visit the site. The police had long since concluded their investigation, and the property was set to be demolished. But Camille wasn't ready to let it go. She needed to see it for herself, to walk through the ashes and see if there was anything the investigators had missed. She stepped over the police tape and made her way through the debris, her boots crunching on the charred wood and broken glass. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt materials, and the silence was eerie. Camille pulled out a small flashlight and began to search, her eyes scanning the ruins for anything that might provide a clue. She started in what had once been the living room. The furniture was reduced to ash, the walls blackened and crumbling. But as she sifted through the debris, she noticed something odd: a section of the floor that seemed less damaged than the rest. Kneeling down, she brushed away the ash and discovered a metal handle embedded in the floor. It was a trapdoor, hidden beneath what had once been a rug. Her heart raced as she pulled on the handle. It was heavy, but it gave way, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. Camille hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and descended. The stairs led to a small, hidden basement, untouched by the fire. The room was sparse, with concrete walls and a single desk in the center. On the desk was a laptop, its screen dark but intact. Camille's hands trembled as she opened the laptop. To her surprise, it powered on, though it was password protected. She tried a few obvious combinations: Holloway's birthday, his wife's name, but none worked. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she noticed a sticky note tucked under the keyboard. On it was a series of numbers: 042876. She entered the numbers, and the laptop unlocked. The desktop was cluttered with files, most of them labeled with cryptic names. Camille opened the first one and found herself staring at a spreadsheet filled with financial transactions. It was a record of Holloway's secret account, detailing every withdrawal and deposit. But there was something else. A list of names, each accompanied by a dollar amount. Camille recognized some of the names. They were prominent politicians, business leaders, and even a few journalists. Her stomach churned as she realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just a slush fund, it was a bribery network. Holloway had been paying off powerful people to keep his secrets safe. And now, it seemed, he had paid someone to help him disappear. Camille quickly copied the files onto a flash drive she had brought with her, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. This was the evidence she needed. the proof that Holloway had been involved in something far bigger than anyone had realized. But as she closed the laptop, she heard a noise above her. The sound of footsteps. Her heart leapt into her throat. She turned off the flashlight and crouched behind the desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps grew louder, and then a beam of light swept across the basement. Someone was up there, and they were coming down. Camille's mind raced. She couldn't be caught here, not now, not with the evidence in her hands. She looked around for another way out, but the basement had only one entrance. She was trapped. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and a voice called out, "Who's there?" Camille recognized the voice. It was Detective Mark Harris, the lead investigator on the Holloway case. She hesitated, then stood up, holding her hands in the air. "It's me," she said, "Camille Harper." Harris shone his flashlight in her face, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here? This is a crime scene." "I know," Camille said, her voice steady despite her fear, "but I found something you need to see." She handed him the flash drive, and he frowned as he plugged it into his own laptop. As he scrolled through the files, his expression grew darker. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "It was on Holloway's laptop," Camille said. "He's been paying people off, and I think he staged his own death to cover it up." Harris was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "This changes everything, but you shouldn't have come here alone. It's not safe." Camille nodded, her relief tempered by the realization that Harris was right. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than she had anticipated, and the people involved wouldn't hesitate to silence her if they found out what she knew. As they left the basement, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the ruins of the house were silent and still. Still, the sense of unease lingered, a reminder that the danger was far from over. Detective Mark Harris took the flash drive back to the police station, promising Camille that he would look into the files and follow up on the leads. But as the days passed, Camille grew increasingly anxious. She had expected the police to act quickly, to expose Holloway's corruption and clear her name once and for all. Instead, there was silence. The media, which had been so eager to cover every twist and turn of her trial, now seemed uninterested in the story. It was as if the world had moved on, leaving Camille to deal with the fallout alone. Frustrated and desperate for answers, Camille decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to a journalist named Elena Martinez, a woman who had written about Holloway's corruption in the past. They met at a quiet cafe, and Camille handed over a copy of the files she had found in Holloway's basement. "This could be huge," Elena said as she scrolled through the documents on her laptop. "If these files are real, they could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country." "They're real," Camille said, "but no one seems to care. The police have had this information for days, and nothing's happened." Elena frowned. "That's not surprising. Holloway had a lot of friends in high places. If these files implicate them, they're not going to let this story get out." "Then we have to make sure it does," Camille said. "We have to expose the truth, no matter what it takes." Elena nodded, her expression serious. "I'll start working on this right away." "But you need to be careful, Camille. If these people find out you're behind this, they'll come after you." Camille knew Elena was right, but she didn't care. She had spent months fighting for her freedom, and she wasn't about to stop now. She had the truth on her side, and she was determined to see justice done. Over the next few days, Camille and Elena worked together to piece together the story. They cross-referenced the names in Holloway's files with public records, uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond the senator. There were bribes, kickbacks, and secret deals involving some of the most powerful people in the country. It was a scandal that could shake the foundations of the political system, if they could get the story out. But as they worked, Camille began to notice strange things. Her phone would ring in the middle of the night, only to go silent when she answered. She would see the same car parked outside her apartment, its driver watching her from behind dark sunglasses. And then there were the messages. Anonymous emails and texts, warning her to stop digging. "They're trying to scare you," Elena said when Camille told her about the messages. "But we can't let them win. We're too close." Camille agreed, but the threats were taking a toll. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the fear that someone was watching her every move. She knew she was in danger, but she couldn't stop now. She had come too far to turn back. Finally, Elena finished the story. It was a bombshell, a detailed exposé that laid bare the corruption at the highest levels of power. She sent it to her editor, who promised to run it as the lead story in the next day's paper. Camille felt a surge of hope as she read the draft. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. But the next morning, the story didn't run. Elena called Camille, her voice shaking with anger and frustration. "They killed it," she said. "My editor said it was too sensitive, and that we needed more evidence. But I know what really happened. Someone got to him. Someone shut us down." Camille felt a wave of despair. If even the media was too afraid to tell the truth, what hope did she have? But then she remembered the files, the evidence she had risked everything to uncover. If the newspapers wouldn't publish the story, she would find another way. She uploaded the files to a secure server and sent the link to every journalist, activist, and whistleblower she could think of. Within hours, the story began to spread. Social media exploded with outrage as people shared the files and demanded answers. The names in Holloway's network began to trend, and the pressure on the authorities to act became overwhelming. Camille watched it all unfold from her apartment, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. But as the hours passed, the fear began to take over. The people she had exposed were powerful, and they wouldn't take this lying down. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and it contained only 2 words: "You're next." Camille's hands trembled as she read the message. She knew what it meant. She had made enemies, and they were coming for her. But she also knew that she had done the right thing. She had fought for the truth, and no matter what happened next, she could hold her head high. The fallout from the leaked files was immediate and explosive. Within days, several high-profile figures named in Holloway's network were under investigation. Resignations, arrests, and public apologies dominated the news cycle. The scandal rocked the political establishment, and the public's trust in their leaders was shattered. Camille Harper watched it all unfold from the relative safety of her apartment, but she knew better than to think the danger had passed. The anonymous threats had escalated. Strange cars lingered outside her building at all hours, and her phone buzzed constantly with messages from blocked numbers. Some were vague warnings, others explicit threats. Camille tried to stay calm, but the fear was always there, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She had exposed the truth, but at what cost? Lisa Morales, her defense attorney, urged her to go into hiding. "You've made powerful enemies, Camille," Morales said during one of their frequent phone calls. "These people don't play fair. If they can't silence the story, they'll try to silence you." Camille knew Morales was right, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. This was her home, her city, and she wasn't going to let anyone chase her out. Still, she took precautions. She installed security cameras in her apartment, changed her locks, and avoided going out alone. She also reached out to Detective Mark Harris, hoping he could offer some protection. Harris was sympathetic but cautious. "I'll do what I can," he said, "but my hands are tied. The department's under a lot of pressure right now, and some of the people you've exposed still have friends in high places. Be careful, Camille. These people are dangerous." Camille nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to back down. She had fought too hard to let them win now. One evening, as she was reviewing the latest news coverage of the scandal, her doorbell rang. Camille froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the security camera feed showed a man in a dark coat standing outside her door, his face obscured by a hood. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but then the man spoke. "Camille, it's me, Elena." Camille's breath caught in her throat. Elena Martinez, the journalist who had helped her expose the story, was supposed to be out of town, laying low until the heat died down. What was she doing here? Camille opened the door cautiously, and Elena stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said, her voice urgent. "Something's happened." Camille led her to the living room, her mind racing. What's going on? Are you okay? Elena shook her head. I've been getting threats too. Worse than yours. They've been following me, breaking into my apartment. I think they're trying to scare me into dropping the story. Camille's stomach churned. We knew this would happen, but we can't let them win. We have to keep fighting. Elena nodded, but her expression was grim. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. They're relentless, Camille. And they're not just threatening me, they're threatening my family. Camille reached out and took Elena's hand, her heart aching for her friend. We'll figure this out. Together. We've come too far to give up now. But even as she spoke the words, Camille couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The people they were up against were powerful, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. And now, it seemed, they were coming for everyone involved. Camille and Elena spent the next few days working together to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. They moved between safe houses, using burner phones and encrypted messages to communicate. The stress was relentless, but Camille refused to give up. She had come too far to let fear dictate her actions. One evening, as they sat in a dimly lit motel room, Elena handed Camille a folder. I found something, she said, her voice low. Something big. Camille opened the folder and began to read. Inside were documents detailing a secret meeting between Holloway and several of his associates just days before the fire. The meeting had taken place at a private estate outside the city, and the agenda was chilling. A plan to silence anyone who threatened to expose their corruption. This is it, Camille said, her voice trembling with excitement. This is the proof we need. If we can tie Holloway to this meeting, we can prove he staged his own death to escape justice. Elena nodded, but her expression was grim. There's more. Look at the last page. Camille flipped to the end of the folder and felt her blood run cold. The final document was a list of names. People who had been targeted by Holloway's network. Some of the names were crossed out, others marked with a single word. Handled. They've been eliminating anyone who got too close, Elena said, and now we're on that list. Camille's mind raced. If Holloway and his associates were willing to kill to protect their secrets, then she and Elena were in even more danger than they had realized. But they couldn't back down now. They had to see this through to the end. We need to get this to the authorities, Camille said. But we can't trust anyone. Not even the police. Elena agreed. We'll leak it to the press. All of it. If we make it public, they won't be able to cover it up. They spent the next few hours preparing the documents for release, redacting sensitive information to protect innocent parties while ensuring the full scope of the corruption was exposed. When they were finished, they uploaded the files to a secure server and sent the link to every major news outlet they could think of. The response was immediate. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The names of Holloway's associates trended on social media, and the public outcry was deafening. Politicians who had once been untouchable were now facing calls for resignation, and law enforcement agencies were forced to open investigations. But as the scandal unfolded, the threats against Camille and Elena intensified. One night, as they were preparing to move to a new safe house, they heard a noise outside. Camille peered through the blinds and saw two men in dark clothing approaching the door. We need to go, she whispered, her heart pounding. Now. They grabbed their bags and slipped out the back door, moving quickly and quietly through the shadows. But as they reached the car, one of the men spotted them and shouted. Camille and Elena jumped into the car and sped away, their pursuers close behind. The chase was chaotic, the narrow streets of the city twisting and turning as Camille tried to lose their tail. But the men were relentless, their car weaving through traffic with terrifying precision. Finally, Camille saw an opportunity. She swerved into an alley, the car's tires screeching as they rounded a corner. The men followed, but they were going too fast. Their car slammed into a dumpster, the impact sending debris flying. Camille didn't stop. She drove until they were miles away, her hands shaking on the wheel. When they finally pulled over, Elena turned to her, her face pale. That was too close, Elena said, her voice trembling. We can't keep doing this, Camille. We're not going to make it. Camille took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. We don't have a choice. If we stop now, they win. And I'm not going to let that happen. Elena nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They both knew the stakes. They were fighting a war they might not survive. But they couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The leaked documents had done their job. The public outcry was deafening, and the pressure on law enforcement to act was overwhelming. Within days, arrests were made, and several high-profile figures were indicted on charges of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy. The scandal dominated the news, and the names of those involved became synonymous with greed and betrayal. But for Camille and Elena, the victory was bittersweet. They had exposed the truth, but the cost had been high. The threats against them had only grown more intense, and they knew it was only a matter of time before their enemies struck back. One evening, as they sat in a secluded cabin far from the city, Camille received a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "You should have stayed out of this." Her heart raced as she showed the message to Elena. "They're coming for us," Camille said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to end this, now." Elena nodded, her expression grim. "There's only one way to do that. We need to find Holloway. If we can prove he's alive and bring him to justice, it's over." Camille agreed, but finding Holloway was easier said than done. He had disappeared without a trace, and even with all the resources at their disposal, they had no leads. But then, as they were reviewing the documents one last time, Camille noticed something she had missed before: a reference to a private airstrip in a remote part of the country. It was a long shot. But it was the only lead they had. They set out early the next morning, driving for hours through winding mountain roads until they reached the airstrip. It was a small, secluded facility, surrounded by dense forest. As they approached, they saw a single plane on the runway, its engines idling. "That's him," Camille said, her heart pounding. "It has to be." They parked a safe distance away and watched as a figure emerged from the plane. Even from a distance, Camille recognized him: Senator Richard Holloway. He was alive, and he was trying to flee. Camille and Elena exchanged a look, their resolve hardening. They couldn't let him get away. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. They moved quickly and quietly, staying low to avoid being seen. As they approached the plane, they heard Holloway's voice, sharp and angry, as he argued with someone on the phone. "I don't care what it takes," he snapped. "Just make sure they're dealt with, permanently." Camille's blood ran cold. She knew who he was talking about. She and Elena were out of time. They stepped out of the shadows, and Holloway froze, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Holloway recovered, his expression twisting into a sneer. "You," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Camille stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "It's over, Holloway. The truth is out. You can't run forever." Holloway laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won? You're nothing but a nuisance, and I'll make sure you're dealt with like one." Before Camille could respond, Elena stepped forward, holding up her phone. "We've been live streaming this whole time," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Everything you've said, everything you've done. It's all out there. The world is watching, Holloway. You're finished." Holloway's face turned pale, and for the first time, Camille saw fear in his eyes. He lunged toward Elena, but Camille stepped in his way, shoving him back with all her strength. He stumbled, falling to the ground, and before he could get up, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived. Camille and Elena stepped back as officers surrounded Holloway, cuffing him and reading him his rights. He struggled, shouting curses and threats, but it was no use. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and there was no escape. As Holloway was led away, Camille felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. They had won. But as she turned to Elena, she saw the toll the fight had taken on her friend. Elena's face was pale, her hands trembling, and there was a haunted look in her eyes. "We did it," Camille said softly, reaching out to take Elena's hand. "It's over." Elena nodded, but her voice was barely a whisper. At what cost, Camille? At what cost? Camille didn't have an answer. They had exposed the truth and brought down some of the most powerful people in the country, but the fight had left them scarred. They had lost friends, their safety, and a part of themselves in the process. But as they stood there, watching Holloway being driven away, Camille knew they had done the right thing. They had fought for justice, and no matter what happened next, they could hold their heads high.
If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.